Hello, I'm Captain Chuck Dyer, your FedEx MEC Chairman. I'm joined today by Captain Pat May and Greg Reardon. Pat's your Negotiating Committee Chairman, and Greg is a Consulting Actuary with Chiron Corporation, who's been working with us on the development project of the retirement plan that we're asking you to consider. So Pat, Greg, welcome. Good to see you guys.
Thanks, Chuck.
We have a diversified plan as it currently is. We have combination, defined benefit, defined contribution. Each of them have different attributes that we find desirable. So now we're considering another defined benefit plan, not a defined contribution plan. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chuck. Our focus so far since we began the project over a year ago now, we started off with trying to understand what the constraints were on the current defined benefit plan and why we've had friction in negotiations trying to improve that plan.
So that leads me to this, then why are we considering a variable plan vice just increasing the final average earnings cap or the 2% multiplier, some other way to just get our current benefit up where we believe it should be?
Certainly the simple thing, Chuck, would be to just improve our A-plan formula in some manner, either raise the cap or change the percentage. That would obviously have an immediate and direct impact on our pilots. But obviously the friction we've faced there has been a negotiation due to the cost to the company, the funding and accounting cost that creates. What we've found is that that plan worked really well when it was designed and constructed in '99, and it worked well throughout the years. The problem is it hasn't grown for inflation. So that 260 cap, we finally have pilots that get into that 260 cap and now far exceed that 260 cap. So if you take, say, your average 1,000-hour pilot, that pilot was able to exceed the cap on an hourly basis in 2008. In other words, we had a $260 an hour rate in 2008. Certainly before that time, pilots were already exceeding that rate. The other issue is the 25 years of service cap. Prior to the regulated age change, the pilots were mandated to retire by age 60. Obviously that change occurred, but our plan stayed the same. It hasn't grown or adapted itself to that new paradigm. And we find that the pilots' actual decisions to delay retirement, and they do now, is affected. So they go at 63 and 64 years old. That's the peak, if you would, in our retirements. So we haven't been able to capture anything above and beyond 25 years of service. So it's the combination of the years of service cap, the pay cap, and the inflation issues that we've really hit stonewall with the current plan.
So Greg, you weren't here when we went through our last round of bargaining back for our 2015 contract, but we had quite a dust up between a diversified plan, DBDC, like we currently have, or transitioning to a defined contribution only type plan, as many of the other airlines have done, mostly in bankruptcies. There is one example of an airline that chose to do this and go into that. But what would you say about, a DC only solution? How do you feel that would measure up against a diversified solution?
So when you think about a DC only solution, the current average age of the pilots today is about age 55. So that means that if you went straight to a DC plan, you have these age 55 folks that are only going to earn accumulation in DC plan for up to 5 to 10 years during pre-retirement, during their work. And that's just not a long enough period to accumulate funds for retirement. So that's one concern that I see. Another concern is about the risk. So in a DC plan, all that longevity risk, so outliving your assets in a DC account is all on the pilot's back, as well as the investment risk. So the pilots are actually doing their own investing in a DC plan. So all that risk is on the pilots, whereas if you shift to a DB plan, all that risk is pooled. So in terms of longevity, all the pilots are in a pool. In terms of investment return, we look for professionals and get their advice in terms of investment. So we really see that risk diversificate across the fund.
Okay. Anything, Pat, on that?
I think ultimately, obviously, the MEC made the decision at the time to go ahead and keep our retirement plan balanced, in that we have both DC and we have a DB plan. And those risks that Greg talked about and referred to, they kind of offset each other and really play off each other pretty well in our current structure. So I think that brings us back to the discussion of well, if you only try and fix the DC portion of the plan, well, we're going to run into IRS limits there. We'll start pushing our own money out of the plan, or the potential to do that. So the balance that it offers us as highly compensated employees to have two buckets to actually have as investment vehicles, retirement vehicles, is useful.
Fair enough. Hey, Greg, would you mind, if you could, speaking to the IRS limits that Pat referenced on DC side of the house?
Right. So for 2018, there is a DC maximum limit. So the limit is $55,000 for contributions going into a DC account. And so that's pilot's money, so pre-tax deferrals. And that limit currently is $18,500. And then the remaining amount would be from the employer, FedEx. But all money going into a DC account can only go up to that $55,000 limit. Outside of that, then there's tax implications and issues such as that. So what we find is in a DC plan, those limits are prohibitive in accumulating account balances. And the limits are also much smaller than limits you see in a DB plan.
I know one of the other things that was considered, especially toward in-game bargaining, was the idea of offering a couple of different plans. One of our counterparts did just that in a vehicle they called the Choice Plan, where they had a DC only option, and they had actually, I believe, 3 options in their plans. Is that something we would consider or would think is prudent to separate our pilots into various plans?
I think there's some inherent problems with going down that route. First is there's a self-selection issue in that the pilots would self-select in a specific plan, and they may or may not make the best choice there. It also drives up the plan cost dramatically for the employer. The other problem with that is now if you have 3 separate or 2 separate and distinct plan designs, then ultimately in future negotiations, you could see that you may end up having leverage used against you, and that that they may target trying to improve one plan and not the other, and that would be something that we would struggle with from a negotiating perspective for as long as you had those diversified or 3 separate plans. We'd like to prevent that. We'd like to have a plan that recognizes that the new hires, the folks that aren't here yet, should be part of the plan that we're currently working towards improving.
So we've probably somewhat answered the question already, but the question would be, why would FedEx consider bargaining outside Section 6?
Yeah, I think there's, obviously we have an interest in bargaining outside of Section 6 because we wouldn't have to wait until 2021. So we put value in our members' pockets sooner rather than later, which is always a good thing for us. And I think, FedEx certainly would recognize the value in this plan. And if you remove, and this project is a large project, it takes a lot of effort. We brought in outside consultants to help us through this. And to try and have this level of work and to do this amount of work inside Section 6, I think it would be too cumbersome. It would be too much to ask for any one negotiating team or any MEC group to take on. It's an all-encompassing project. We've had to put a lot of resources, union resources from the negotiating committee, R&I, communication. Obviously, the MEC has been involved. And then our outside resources that we brought in, both with Chiron and Dave Blitzstein as our consultant, plus the national assets, the ALPA national assets. It's an immense project. I think that level of work and the required effort could only be done outside of Section 6.
What happens if we go through a 1993 OBRA type event, Greg? If they were to drop that number, where's that leave us?
Right, so we understand the pilots are sensitive to that as they had worked through that years ago. So the plan design that we have created actually self-corrects for an issue like that. And essentially what happens is that if those compensation limits for the IRS were cut in half, for example, that means that outside of any changes, the benefits would be reduced, and therefore the pension liability would be reduced. But at the same time, FedEx is putting in contributions into the fund, and those contributions, like I said earlier, are a fixed, for example, percentage of uncapped pay. So the contributions coming into the fund do not change. So the IRS limit may change, but the contributions would not change. And so what happens is the contributions are still supporting the current design. And so there's excess assets now when you measure against a lower, artificially lower liability. And so simply the plan would be amended to increase accruals back to where they would have been without that IRS issue. So you could think of it also as a current accrual rate times a high pay, or a higher accrual rate times a lower pay. You'll get the same answer.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I like that. So now we're modeling, your company's modeling, Greg, and I know you've played a huge role in developing this with us to our specific needs. And I know from what I've seen in presentations that we're identifying populations that could come up short in a transition from the existing plan, to a variable plan. What can we do to ensure that those populations don't come up short? What tools are available to us to get at that problem?
Well, first of all, we can certainly ensure that we can identify that group correctly, and that's simply a data exercise. So we have data, we have census, we have service, we have pay information, and we can calculate the pilot's benefit to understand how they may make out under the current plan versus the new plan. We also understand, too, that there's a concern about pilots who have not yet hit that $260,000 five-year average pay cap. And so we can certainly identify that group as well. And then we can take a look through PAT and MEC and understand what options are available to make them whole so that no one's left back behind and that they're, receiving a benefit just as large as they would have under the existing plan.
Okay, I know that probably about half of our pilots are going to be very happy to hear that, because I think that it's about half that probably don't have a 260 high five at this point. This leads us to the question of transitioning from the current plan to a variable plan. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think some people think the current plan goes away for some reason. I think there are people that think the current plan converts to the variable plan. There seems to be differing road, but I would like to be clear so people understand what happens with the current plan and how the transition, how basically the variable plan would fundamentally stack on top of the accumulated benefit now. So if you could talk to that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, the way I think of it is it's an A plus B feature. You have one benefit, that's the current plan benefit. That benefit can be calculated, again, with all the data. That benefit cannot decrease per IRS rules. That is an accrued benefit. The pilot is entitled to that current accrued benefit. That does not decrease. And then going forward, there's a brand new plan starting on day one, no assets, no liabilities. And for future pilot service, they begin to accrue under the variable benefit plan, such that at retirement, when they retire, they'd likely get two checks, one from their current plan and one from the new plan. But again, you add up the two in total, and that's the total benefit.
Okay, anything to add, Pat?
Yeah, obviously the transition is the challenging aspect of this. The plan design actually is really easy and straightforward. It's been done before. We have different, obviously, economic features to the plan that come into consideration. But ultimately, the fact that we can identify by pilot name and number, employee number, who's in the demographic that may be negatively impacted in the transition, well, now we know who we need to bring up to whole. Because we're not in this to obviously reduce or eliminate that person's benefit. We don't want to harm anybody in this. This would not be a useful effort to hurt any single pilot. So we're going to make sure every pilot is brought up at least to whole or better.
So switching gears to another common crew room question. This one will go to you, Pat. I won't put Greg on the spot. So David Blitzstein, we hired to consult with us, and we've obviously turned to Chiron to work on the development project and actually design the plan. I think there are some out there that believe these gents stand to benefit directly, like they're selling us a plan, like an insurance salesman, if you would. Can you address how they're compensated and whether or not there's a long-term conflict maybe established here?
That's a Great question. Up front, we established contracts with Chiron and David Blitzstein. They're two separate contracts. They don't cross over at all. There's no agreement between David Blitzstein or Chiron. David Blitzstein works as a consultant with a monthly fee on his retainer. Chiron works for us at an hourly rate. When the plan is done or when our work is complete, whether that be through negotiation or FedEx just says no thanks, our work with both Chiron and David will be complete. There's no, if it ends up in us actually completing a deal with FedEx, we have an agreed upon LOA, Chiron receives no bonus, they receive no remuneration at all, nor does David Blitzstein. So there's no carryover there. There's no conflict of interest at all. In fact, they made very clear, when David recommended Chiron, that there is no conflict of interest. They have no business ties together at all either.
Right. So as I recall, I mean, he really directed us to Chiron for their expertise.
It was because David had experience, and to be quite honest, Chuck, there's not many actuary firms out there that do the type of work that Chiron does. You know, we looked at others out there, but we just felt with the expertise, the proprietary modeling that Chiron offered us, especially our group, our pilots want to get in there and manipulate these models and change them, and Chiron brought that to the table for us.
If you went through to the point where you bargained a tentative agreement, who would have the final say on whether or not we accept such an agreement?
So anything that would affect retirement and the current benefits would have to go out to the pilots for full ratification. In other words, it would go out to be an LOA, a letter of agreement. And that letter of agreement would be in front of the pilots with all the information they need to help make them make an educated decision. So the pilots would, by ratification vote, either approve or disapprove the negotiated agreement.
Okay, just very similar to a full contract
That's exactly
ratification
right.
process, all right. To build a modeler, to discuss this with the membership, even when we discussed it with the company, some assumptions had to be taken into account just to present something. What types of assumptions? What do we, basically our pilots are going to have to understand the underlying assumptions that they're looking at when they look at this. What kind of assumptions would they be taking into account?
So there are a couple of different areas of assumptions. One is just simply economic assumptions, so salary scale. So, how fast is a pilot's salary going to increase in the future? What's the expectation there? So that's a compensation increase assumption. Also, just another general assumption when working with the model is, we have the pilot's current age, and then we put in a retirement assumption. So how much longer are they going to work? Is it 55? Is it age 60, 63, 65? But that's also another assumption, retirement. And we assume that between the current age and the retirement age, they'll be in full-time continuous employment flying. So there's no issues with break in service. Those are some of the economic assumptions. And then we kind of get a little bit more granular into the plan provisions. And there's actually assumptions built into the plan provisions like a hurdle rate. So that's that target expected return for the variable benefit plan. And whenever the actual investment return is greater than that hurdle rate, benefits would increase. And similarly, if actual investment return is below that hurdle rate, the benefit would decrease. So what exactly is the hurdle rate? And then what do we expect for future investment returns to what might that look like in the plan?
Okay.
And we also are thinking about too is, when we look at these individual benefit modelers, they're going to see a snapshot. They're going to see, okay, what might benefit be in the new plan if the investments earn X. And what we would like to do is show a bit of what we call a confidence interval. So say, well, yes, your benefit is this based on a 5% return and hurdle rate, but it can be much higher, with a certain confidence level. So it gives the pilots an idea about, okay, I am here, I'm above the current plan, that's great, but I can be up here. There's a lot of upside potential in the new plan design, and I think it's important that they understand that upside potential.
Okay, so they'll see kind of a worst case line and then see with varying degrees of confidence what above that line could occur.
Correct.
Okay. Not to put too fine a point on it, but I want to make sure people understand it. Should something first off be directed by the MEC to go and bargain. Company engages, we actually bargain to a tentative agreement. Who would have the final say on whether or not such a plan would be accepted?
Yeah, again, on Section 28 retirement issue, this is definitely something that the pilots would have the final say on in full ratification. So it would be an LOA, letter of agreement, for the pilots to decide, yes, this is what I want to do, or no.
Okay. Greg, before we close out here, any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
A couple of thoughts come to mind. One is I understand that this variable benefit plan is a new concept to a lot of the pilots, if not all the pilots. But I would say that this concept has been around for many years. And in fact, Chiron has worked on a number of plans that have a variable benefit feature in them. And the IRS has also reviewed these types of plans and have signed off on the plan provisions. So there's no IRS issues with this type of plan. I'd also say too, going forward and looking in the future, what we think about is, the future of the DB plan is that there is going to be some flexibility in that plan provision, like the variable benefit plan. And in fact, we have worked on a number of accounts where either a DB plan, and in the concept of a traditional DB plan, has frozen and then went to a DC plan and then said, you know what, I don't want the DC plan anymore, froze the DC plan and went to a variable benefit plan. So it's basically the opposite of what we're seeing typically in the DB world, where the plans just freeze and go to the DC plan. We've seen a DC plan freeze and go to a variable benefit plan. So that's something to take into account. And there's a reason that that the DC plan just does not work for a lot of members.
It's interesting you bring that up. This last week, I got called by a reporter at Bloomberg, and there was interest in just what you're talking about. They're seeing interest out there now in migrating back from defined contribution back to defined benefit because of the variable plan's introduction. And since we're as far along as we are in this development project, I think word's getting out, so a reporter called, wanted to talk about our project and where we are. One thing I need to make clear to our guys as this goes on is, with that discussion with the Bloomberg reporter, was not an indication that any decision to go forward has been made. That being said, I was happy to talk to him because I do think this is a plan that's going to benefit a lot of people ultimately, and if something we've done can help with that, I think we're all feeling pretty good about that. Pat, final thoughts?
I was happy today at that joint council meeting because it was a full room. So I know our message is getting out there, and I know the pilots are starting to pay attention. Some of them have been paying attention from day one, but certainly it may seem to them that this has been slow going, the information, and there's a reason behind it. There's a reason behind us being very methodical and careful, because we don't want to make any mistakes along the way. We don't want to get too far ahead of the pilots. We want to make sure that we're looking and evaluating everything we can. As we build the education for the pilots, and today, as you saw, was the first day that we actually put real numbers in front of them. It may seem from their perspective, well, that's just new hire numbers. Well, we have to have a baseline of understanding of the concept of the plan and exactly what it can do, what it's capable of doing in terms of developing a benefit. The next layer of that information and that education will be for the pilots that are here. So we'll take some examples and we'll show various age groups of pilots with certain years of service. And we'll do the full spectrum. So don't be surprised if you see a very young or very old pilot ready to go out in retirement, and you're going to see numbers, because we want you to understand how the plan affects those pilots. So it is going to continue to be slow, it's going to be methodical, and we're going to be in a position so that the MEC feels comfortable having that discussion with the pilots and really understanding where they're at. And if they have a desire to move forward in evaluating this plan and presenting a proposal to FedEx, and if FedEx is interested, we want the pilots on board. If the pilots aren't on board with this, then we need to stop. We need to stop evaluating, trying to improve their retirement.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I thank you guys. Thank you for everything today. For you guys out there, you're going to get a lot of information brought to you over the next several weeks. We're going to get into the plan details. We're going to give you as thorough explanation to the details as we can and the things we're considering, both in the details, the plan, and strategically. When you get these opportunities, video, printed material, meetings that occur, webcasts, call-ins, please take the opportunity to ask your questions and get them answered. Don't make assumptions. Don't listen to things you hear out, beyond the development team and beyond what we've got here. We are trying to give the information to you. There is bad information floating around, I know that. I believe that's going to dry up as we provide more detail, and I think the conversation we're going to have over the next several weeks is going to be a very productive conversation. This education process will also include the survey project that Pat talked about. I think you can expect multiple surveys, ultimately an online survey to ensure everybody has a chance to be heard. And then with all that in mind, I expect the MEC to be in a position to make a final decision should the company decide they want a bargain. We have to ultimately decide whether we have support or we don't for this project. No one's trying to usurp the membership's voice on this. As a matter of fact, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure you're knowledgeable and your voice is heard. With that in mind, I'd just like to tell you guys to please do your best to learn the material, and as you go about your business out there flying these airplanes all over the world, do your best to be safe and take care of each other. Thank you.